let me just introduce myself. My name is Dr. Lawrence A. Rashid. I'm the African American Student Program Coordinator at LCC, Lane Community College. And that's enough about me. Um, but what I would like to say is that I am fortunate to teach the only Black male studies in the state of Oregon. So
Mm.
if you would like to enroll in the course, I think there's still about 10 more spaces. It's kind of filling up. It's kind of filling up in a short amount of time because it got on the books late. But anyway, enough about that. But you could go ahead and look that up. It's on the website. It's on the flyer. Those of you who saw the flyer and everything, so definitely check out the course. You'll learn more about scholars that we have the pleasure of being here, Dr. T. Hassan, and the work that he's doing in Black male studies. And we're just going to get into it. So again, thank you for being here. Again, I know people are still coming in, but time is really of the essence. And again, it's a pleasure to have Tia Dr. Johnson, take time out of this busy schedule to be here. So enough about that. We're just going to get into it, right? And so this is my brother, so we just talk and we rap when we can, right? Because both of us are extremely busy. He's more busy than I am because he's a celebrity superstar. But I want people to get a true sense of who you are. So who better to do that than to for you to introduce yourself? And I know that may be rude and everything, but I know he's a humble brother and everything, but I just want you to give us, the Cliff Notes version, if you will, because you could Google the brother, but the Cliff Notes version of, a little background bio information of who you are, which your institution of higher learning you're affiliated with, and some of your other works, and then we just going to get right into the conversation. So go ahead, brother. Thank you.
Okay, well, first and foremost, thank you for having me, man. It's always an honor to get to talk to my brother. Um, I am faculty in Africana Studies, professor here at Fresno State. I've been here about 17 years now, but I've been teaching for going on 27. So my primary field is Africana Studies, and my primary research area is Black male studies. Um, and so, yeah, I've been publishing and doing research in that area for probably about 15 years, more formally. Um, I attended Cal State Dominguez Hills for my bachelor's work, Temple University for my master's, Claremont Graduate University for my doctorate, and just kind of been building from there. I have a website you can check out. I also carry a show on YouTube called The Onyx Report. I founded the Institute for Black Male Studies. I'm transitioning that to another platform, so the website is not up for that, and it'll be up probably in the next few weeks. But I'm trying to think of what else, what else I can tell you. I'm not really used to talking about myself, but yeah, those are some of the areas there. So.
No, but he's being very humble. This brother is he's a tenured professor, right? So that's important, right? Especially in these times. That means he's done his due diligence and everything, right? To secure that space. And I'm pretty sure he could be more than a tenured professor if he wanted to. We kind of had that conversation yesterday, but we're not going to go there. So, for our listening audience, and again, for those of you who are just coming in, thank you for being here. I know we have some students who are participating and everything, maybe to get some extra credit. But again, be that as it may, glad that you're here and everything. And you really haven't missed too much if you're just now joining us. Dr. Asana just gave a brief bio, kind of like his educational background and what he does. So, of course, this is going to be recorded, so you could definitely catch the replay later, and I can make it available for you all. So, with that being said, we're just going to get into it. So, Dr. Hassan, in your own words, can you give us a working definition of what Black male studies is?
Well, I think Black male studies in many respects is a corrective as far as how Black men have been studied, analyzed, and portrayed both in the public, but most particularly within the academy. And there's been a maligning of sorts that's been taking place for quite a while in the academy. So I think black male studies has existed in an informal way and in a more formal way, especially with the advent of The Man Not by Tommy Curry several years ago. He kind of kicked in the door and created a new foundation for the study of black males. But it's really more an empirically based approach to studying black male life, black male quality of life, and whatnot. And I think that's a major shift because I think prior to that, black men were described, I should say black boys and men were described based more so on stereotype, conjecture, and I mean, even personal experiences. I mean, look, I attended a conference years ago in Black Studies, a Black Studies conference, and I've seen people give presentations on black males, and we're talking about professors who are degreed and have established positions, and they're talking about black males in what do you call it, straight damn, I'm like
Derogatory.
keynote presentations where they're talking about their sister's brother's cousin's boy. You know what I mean? It's really informal. A lot of the time there's not a lot of data. It's just these kind of stories that are usually framed around black male lack, right? Ideas about black men, black boys failing, not having motivation, but it's very much based on a very personal approach, a very, subjective analysis. And so I think there was a kind of sensibility going, especially after the 1990s, where you had this kind of sense that everything there was to know about black males has been explored. And much of that was whittled down to incarceration and drugs. It really got to that point, even within Africana studies, where much of the time the discussion on males was very matter of fact. It was very, we all kind of know what the situation is, and that was kind of it. But what you found with this new movement of studying black males empirically is that many of the assumptions we made were not accurate much of the time, and we had to actually begin to explore and reanalyze and question the long-term assumptions that we've made about black males for years, and really begin to understand why there were so many differences between the stereotypes and the realities. And sometimes that even led to a kind of intra-racial comparative framework where you could look at black males and compare them to other groups within the black community, let alone outside of it, and see that there were actually vast differences in certain areas, from graduation rates to matriculation rates, college access, so on and so forth. There were so many different areas where we found that black males were having a very different experience, even from other black demographics. So if that's the case, then we really need to revisit some of these assumptions and kind of crack them open. And I think that's the legacy of people like Tommy Curry, myself, that guy, Dr. Lawrence Rashid, had his work, and several others. And it's been a very small group, but it's been growing.
Yeah.
And so you have black men that are really, well, you have black men, but then you have some others that are also, very curious about the field, and they're coming into it with an earnestness.
Yes.
But one of the core principles I would say that's been coming out of this push has been this appreciation for the empirical. And I think people need to really understand what that meant, because when I was an undergrad, not only was it based, much of it, the conversation based on stereotype and conjecture, a lot of it was just very casual. It was just very off the hip. And so this kind of push toward empiricism keeps us honest. It keeps us focused on what's going on the ground, what can be verified, and it prevents us from straying too far off into other people's opinions about black males. And one of the things Curry did very recently is he wrote a few papers. I mean, the man is a machine, so he's written
Yeah, he is.
so many,
Shout
it's
out to
ridiculous.
Dr. Tommy Curry. That brother, man, listen, really, as you're speaking, I'm interrupting you. Definitely was my motivation for this course and everything. And a lot of
Yeah.
the work that I'm currently doing stems around his research, his scholarship,
Hmm.
his unapologeticness, right? Because
Hmm.
we're going to get into that because you're speaking of the data, right?
Hmm.
There's often there's no refuting the empirical data,
Yeah.
but there's ways in which folks tend to push back in a way that's kind of really kind of like, like,
Yeah.
I mean, people are making up stuff. So I know, but I want to hear from you. We could get into, intersectional invisibility, right? Which I'm kind of going into. But even with the data that is so abundantly clear, there's still this, you know, pathological viewpoint
Yes.
of Black males, even when
Yes.
the data says
Yes.
other. Do you want to
Yes.
elaborate a little bit for that before we go
Well,
into your book?
I just, I'll continue with Curry. I mean, a couple of years ago, he wrote a paper where he was analyzing some of the origins of these kind of pathological arguments about black males being rapists, being violent abusers, even in terms of intimate partner homicide. And Curry was the first I saw to reveal that up through the 1980s, black men were actually more so victims
Yes.
of intimate partner violence, more so than black women even. And nobody, I'd never heard anybody talk about that, but he revealed the data about that. But one of the most groundbreaking things I saw him do is within the field of Africana studies, he was talking about when ideas about black men were transported, so to speak, from racist scholarship into Africana itself by key figures like Bell Hooks and a number of others. And he didn't just say it, he actually documented the arguments and the citations in some key feminist work and then pointed out the racist scholarship that predated it and where those arguments were brought in. So you had, this kind of belief system about black males that we inherited from racist scholarship, and many of us just took it at face value. But he actually documented, and then he problematized the art, the assumptions and the conclusions of that racist scholarship at the same time. So he was showing how inaccurate it was, and then how it was appropriated and internalized within Africana studies through key people. And he names all the people involved. So that those kinds of revelations has led to the field expanding and people asking questions that you really didn't see being asked when I was coming in to the academy, for example. So those are the kind of things that we're seeing kind of taking off.
Yeah, and it just seems like there's a refusal of that scholarship, of the data that speaks to the antithesis of these tropes surrounding black males, and
Hmm.
it just seems to kind of persist, and
Yes.
for no good reason other than that is the again, it's the antithesis of what we are often hearing within our academies, right? It's no, that's not what you're supposed to talk about. You're they don't have there's they're not, and this is Dr. Tommy Curry's work, they're not beings. You know what I mean? They're not, so
Yeah. They're
the
non-beings. Yeah.
erasure
Yeah.
should happen with automaticity. So they're what are
Well,
we talking about here?
but you also saw people's careers advance from the 1970s onward. When they would espouse these kind of pathological arguments about black men, you saw careers advance. So
Yes.
we started to also connect that there were incentives involved in being able to do this, and so that further kind of dredged some of these things up. So when I met Dr. Curry, it was there was a small collective of us that were kind of doing similar research. I think he was at the head of that, in terms of especially being trained as an empiricist. But we all kind of were moving in a direction, but it was very organic. And we kind of
Mhm.
came together and started sharing each other's work and cross-citing each other and then beginning to build from there. But this was not something I'd ever seen. And you saw choice moments with key people like Robert Staples,
Yeah.
you can even go back to Du Bois. There were key figures that would write certain publications at certain points in time that we would now retroactively call black male studies ish or proto black male studies, so to speak. But when it officially kicks in with the creation of the Man Not, it's just been building from there, and we're getting
Yeah, no,
PhDs in the
definitely.
field. So,
Definitely. And even probably could argue the late Kawanza Kajufu as well.
oh
And
yeah, oh yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's groundbreaking work on the conspiracy against, black boys. So
Mhm.
definitely. So I want to get into your book, and around about maybe seven-ish, we'll have some Q&A for those of you who want to have questions. For Dr. Tia Johnson, it'll be available at that time, not any sooner. So actually listening to us, maybe you're jotting down those questions that you may have of him. So we want to get into, I didn't bring, oh, well, I don't want to get off camera, but I do have my book. It's just in my bag over there. I wanted to make sure everybody sees it, but I know he has a book. So put it up, Dr. Hassan, so people can see it and get the book. Excellent book. So we're going to dive right into the text, right? And this brother broke down anti-black misandry this way, that way, and the other way, right? So this is the question that we're going to get into. And
Yeah.
he's sharing the book right now. There, look at that book. So the solutions for anti-black misandry, blackness, and black male death. And again, from our great guest here. So this has been a long time in the making, kind of like having this book talk. This book is in a very interesting series. I don't know if you want to kind of
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
explain that a little bit, but
Well,
needless to say, again, I'm going to say it. I'm pretty sure this particular book has done the best. He's not saying it, but I know I've been speaking to other, black male scholars and everything, and they got wind of this, like, oh man, that was a great book. I have it. You know what I mean? Like my brother, Dr. Brian out of Texas. I mean, people they know the book and they know the work, they know the research. So I don't know if you want to speak to a little bit.
well, I think the early stages of black male studies, obviously the man not kicked in the door, but it was still, it still had to come up from the underground in many
Yes.
respects. Even though it was published Temple University Press, this is published through Rutledge, there was still a kind of underground process. And I know for myself, I kind of stopped publishing for 5 years or so. I didn't stop writing, but I stopped
Mhm.
publishing because I noticed how difficult it was to, even for journal articles for black male study scholars, to get any kind
Yes.
of thing published.
Yes.
So I stopped for a while, and I went to YouTube and just really began to continue my work and have dialogues with different people and kind of expand from there. And I would keep writing, but I just stopped publishing. And then eventually Rutledge approached me and said, well, we got this series. We just want to know if you contribute. So it's a 50,000 word book, because the series, each book is about 50,000 words. So it's a very specifically set kind of
Okay.
series. But they came to me and they said, look, will you publish? And that's something I wasn't used to. Most of the time you're kind of fighting uphill trying to bring
Yes.
in these discussions that a lot of folks don't want to actually have. And at this point, there was a point, I think, where there was a crossover point where they were saying, you know what, this is new. People need to hear this. And then they just started approaching. So they asked me. And I said, well, sure. I probably had about 3 or 4 books written on my hard drive that and I'm still plugging away. Not as fast as Tommy, but I'm still,
Tommy's a machine.
yeah, he's a
Dr. Curry's
machine.
a
But
machine. He's probably
yeah.
working on 3 articles as we speak. Again, shout
Oh,
out to our good brother, Dr. Tommy
he's working
Curry.
on like 3 books. I talked to him
Man,
a
that
couple of weeks
part.
ago. But yeah, so that's kind of how it got published. They approached me and I was just like, sure. So I, just put some things together and put out some arguments. And I've also been doing some of the work I was doing online, and we'll get into this as we talk. There's a reason it was online. Like, one of the things I developed that this book is based on. It's why it's titled Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, because I can talk about problems all day. I can talk
Right.
about where black men have been mistreated and maligned and underdeveloped and so on and so forth. And I do quite a bit of that in the book just to frame the context. But the latter part of the book is all dedicated to what we call the black male political agenda, which is basically a series of corrective policy ideas that's posted on a website, a live website that people can contribute to. And the only requirement is that you're posing ideas, policy ideas that'll improve the quality of black male life. So this book actually captures that live document and puts it in the book. And the document continues. I think we've actually added 2 more points to the agenda since this book was published. But that's the reason I kind of went to the web. I could sit in my office and do a dry study by myself, analyzing a series of texts, or I could kind of mix that with being in dialogue with people. And so I didn't actually write the agenda alone or myself. I asked people to contribute ideas from all kinds of walks of life. So what is now the 19-point black male political agenda is a series of ideas that mostly black men, there have been others, but
Mhm.
mostly black men have contributed to. And you're talking about a cross section of men that I've never seen this wide, a cross section of black men come together to create ideas. And you're talking about across class, occupation, geography. I got men reaching out to me from South Africa to Australia to China, contributing ideas about what kinds of policies will improve the quality of life. And we can walk through a little bit of that later, but I just kind of wanted to say that's where a lot of my work was going, and has been going, and it's been expanding from there. So you kind of got live on the ground responses from people, and I think that's where scholarship needs to go anyway, where it's not just in the ivory tower, you're in communication with people, and that's the legacy of Black studies anyway.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that. I'm like, yeah, that's the legacy. That's the symbiosis of Black studies, right?
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think, we could get into a Black studies conversation, but there's always been this nip and tuck, this back and forth, right?
Hmm.
Should it remain kind of like within a community or have some core connection, right, to the
Right.
community, or should it just be institutionalized? Because we
Exactly.
in the Ivory Tower know better than, you
Right.
know, those unlearned folks in the community, right? And
Right.
so there,
Well,
there's
the idea
still
was
that.
supposed to be that Black Studies was supposed to be somewhat like a think tank where they would come up
Yes.
with ideas to solve problems in the community. And there are arguments and debates about whether or not that's been reduced to mere careerism and so on and so
Mm,
forth. So you still have this tension back and forth within the field about
yes.
producing, ideas that are relevant and not just ideas, even institutions. And so that's still an ongoing press, and there are people doing that. But the conversation I wanted to engage was rooted in people's lived experiences. So these brothers, I mean, you're talking about, nearly homeless guys who are couch surfing and have a smartphone, all the way to university presidents, CEOs at black banks. And I'm not making these terms up. These are brothers that I've met, construction workers and other academics, activists in the community, nonprofit leaders. They're just people engaged in this discussion, coming from all kinds of different points. And I'm not suggesting that everybody agreed about everything, but I
Mhm.
just thought that kind of space would be useful to have a
Absolutely.
conversation about producing new ideas. And that's what the Black Male Political Agenda ended up being, and that's where this book came out of.
No, that's beautiful. That because we're always viewed within the ilk of not being able to get along, right? There's
Right.
always this bifurcation, whether it's, brothers who are considered to be, sexually minoritized or whatever term you want to, same gender, whatever term it is, right? There's
Hmm.
always this bifurcation, right? That is
Hmm.
situated. And I say it's situated upon us because I don't think it's organic. You know what I mean? What is organic is what you just said. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
The coming together of these thoughts and everything that's
Yeah.
hopefully going to lead to the amelioration of policies, practice and so on and so forth for Black males and Black men and boys.
Well, and you also have to take into account that we really didn't have a platform for that. You know what I mean?
True,
Especially
true.
from the 70s onward, there was no public platform where we could dialogue in many respects. So in many ways, we watched, other demographics have platforms. I mean, if you got Steven Spielberg creating films, about your experience where black men are the monsters, then there are certain platforms that have been made available to some people. But it really wasn't until you had social media, that some of these platforms were developed where black men began to dialogue with each other, and it became a very an independent dialogue that wasn't governed by any one or controlled by any one institution outside of maybe the platforms themselves. But short of that, you're just having this free for all conversation, and that space is developing right alongside the conversations that are going on in black male studies. They're not necessarily connected, but they're happening at the same time, and they're happening regarding the same kinds of questions because the environment is imposing on black male life. So black men are trying to figure out solutions and explanations for how we got into this situation, what exactly the nature of our situation is. And the book attempts to address some of that as well, even to the point of describing black male death, and what's going on with that. So, these are you're having multiple responses to the environment itself and how, men want to address it, how men and boys themselves think the best moves are to address these issues. And so there's a conversation going on with the academy. There's a conversation going on with entrepreneurship. There's a conversation going on with the men in all these different kind of sections, kind of having these dialogues, and that's what I think produced a good amount of this.
No, and that's an interesting point. We're going to get into some questions specifically, about the text, but oftentimes, and again, I hear Brother Curry speak to this all the time. Oftentimes, Black males are in a position to advocate or speak to what they're navigating, there's always a framework that's, bequeathed or, you know, thrust upon them, right? And this
Right.
is the framework and everything. And so these are the parameters. And a lot of time, like we mentioned earlier, is very pathological. It is
Right.
very myopic, limiting, what we have done and what we are currently doing.
Mhm.
Speaking of that, what you've done is again a masterpiece. So you've written extensively about anti-Black misandry. How would you describe its most pressing manifestation in today's society? And
Well,
and maybe you want to, for those of us in the audience who are unfamiliar with, anti-Black misandry, maybe you want to just unpack it, generally speaking, before you kind of delve in that a little bit further.
I think there are levels of it. You can talk about the systemic aspects of anti-Black misandry, which a lot of us have focused on from slavery onward. You can talk about it, intra-communally within the Black community. You can talk about it interrelated to other communities. There are different levels of anti-Black misandry, but fundamentally, just looking at the term, you're talking about the hatred of Black males. That's fundamentally what it speaks to. And this is always interesting to me because every time I have a class, and especially when I teach my Black male class, one of the first questions I ask them is, does everybody know what misogyny is? And, everybody raises their hand. And as soon as I ask, does anybody know what misandry is? It's silence. They don't know. There's no familiarity with that. So when we start to, unpack that and go into detail about what anti-Black misandry is and how it functions, it really gets down into the nature of the hatred toward Black men and the various ways it comes about, especially through systemic forces and how that's structured through policy, most particularly. And so Black males experience this on so many levels that it's difficult in many ways to categorize what they all tend to be. And that's one of the things that Black male studies has sought out to do, to explain and analyze just how many different ways that is functioned. So as you know, there's a whole chapter on the book where I go into
Yes. Yeah.
detail, kind of, describing the different types of anti-Black misandry, the different aspects of it. But the whole point is to really understand the nature of it, because I think with Black males, the idea is that these things happen, and as one person said to me, that's just that Black male stuff. In other words, there's so much that's associated with Black males in regard to negativity that there's no sense that this victimization that Black males experience has structure to it and purpose. It's almost treated as if this is just something Black males almost do to themselves, and yeah, there's a little racism in it, but that's it. And again, it goes back to that sensibility I talked about from the 90s, where we kind of think we know all there is to know about Black males, and so you kind of have that sensibility. So as we actually started to really look at the nature of Black male victimization and how many different ways it presents itself, what are the experiences that boys through adult, elders,
Yes.
newborns, really, and that's the nature, the expanse of the research, from newborn Black males all the way to elders on the verge of passing. There are experiences that are specific to Black males on the basis of both their race and their gender. And this obviously takes us to intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw, but the most popular aspects of this connection between this intersection between race and gender has been only framed alongside how this is, how women, especially Black women in particular, experience it. That's how we understand intersectionality. That's how it was introduced to us. And of course, the initial idea was that Black women struggled in terms of race, class, sex, and gender. And tied to that, Black men were privileged because of their maleness. But one of the things we started to research, we started to figure out, and this goes all the way from Athena Matua's work, all the way through Curry, all the way through many of us, was that we actually found, when you looked at the empirical data, Black men weren't privileged because of their maleness. They were actually hyper oppressed because of their maleness. So that was kind of, counterintuitive in terms of how we were introduced to intersectionality. And it raised questions that for a while nobody really wanted to delve in and answer, until Black male studies started to examine the data more thoroughly and found that not only was there not any privilege associated with being Black males at almost any age, that you actually were under threat and barred from access on so many levels, it was ridiculous. And so as we started to kind of tease through that, we found there were so many rich layers there that we almost had to create, it was not even almost, we had to create a new vocabulary, because the vocabulary we were given just through Black studies or Africana studies or Black feminist studies was not nuanced enough to capture what exactly Black males were experiencing. And that's one of the endeavors I've been involved with as well, and I do a little bit of that in this book as well, is create that vocabulary to
Yes,
kind
you
of
do.
make sense of the experiences that Black males have been having that really didn't have a framework, didn't have a kind of verbiage associated that expressed the expanse of what many of them experience. So, that's been one of the other things that I think Black male studies has been involved in, trying to make sense of and term those experiences that hadn't, where we had no voice prior. There was very little discussion about. So yeah.
No, as I was listening to you, you discuss, the lifespan pretty much, from birth, to, our elderly years and everything. And one of the things, I think we discussed this a little bit yesterday on our off-air conversation. One of the things I really been looking into is like early childhood development, whether it's PK or TK, and looking at the ways in which Black males are navigating those spaces. Of course, we know we have the research by Walter Gilliam and the Yale study and everything, and the tracking of the Black males in those environments, right?
Hmm.
But I'm seeing that there needs to be even more still, because I don't think the environment, and I don't think that the educators are fully equipped with the acumen for these young individuals, particularly these young Black males who are, I have an acronym that's called KIDS, kinetic individuals doing something, right? They're full of energy.
Hmm.
You can't take a paradigm that's, structured in a K through 12 kind of manner, like, and this is what Kajuku said all the time, right?
Hmm.
And just think that's going to work. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
that could be for boys in general, right? We kind of talked about now all of a sudden, Dr. Reed's work is coming more prominent, right? Like people are speaking, oh yes, boys need to do all these things. And it's
Oh, Richard
kind of,
Reed. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of curious that now he's featured on, CNN and these different outlets. And it's nothing that Dr. Jupel, yourself, Tommy Curry, none of us have, in this work have not said, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, I wonder why that gets a little bit more attention than scholars that look like me and you have been professing, right?
Sure.
And so I
Sure.
say that to say, like, I think the work of Black male studies does go down to boys, but I think practitioners, and this is my argument, practitioners need to start looking at the research to inform their practice.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts about that as we get more into
Well, go into it a little more. You're saying that practitioners need to do what? Break
they need to be more informed about Black male studies. You know what I mean? As they're engaging in Black boys, other Black males.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant Black
Wow.
male studies practitioners. Okay, I see what
Yes.
you're saying. Yeah.
Yes.
No,
So
absolutely. And I think it's easy to do. I mean, Black males can be maligned and ignored at the same time in a very casual fashion. And I think it's one of the things we're trying to push back against. If you take, for example, the last election, you can take the last couple, in fact. One of the things I noticed is that Black men will be blamed for the outcomes of elections. And this actually occurred last year before the election ended. Black men were blamed for, Kamala Harris's loss before she lost, right? I mean, I started to hear
yeah.
this literally from the day the Democrats chose her to be, the face of who's going to run against Trump. And all the way up through, her actual loss, I kept hearing the same things. Even former President Barack Obama
Yes.
chimed in and suggested that Black men were the problem. But when you look at the statistics, one, we don't have the numbers to be the problem to prevent someone from being elected. Black men alone do not have that. But also, and this is where the empiricism of Black male studies comes in,
Yes.
when you actually look at the track record for Black male voters, it's very left. You know what I mean? We tend to vote to the second highest degree in the Democratic Party under Black women for Democratic candidates, and yet at the same time, we experience voter disenfranchisement more than any other demographic due to incarceration and whatnot. And yet still, we vote to the second highest level, but we're constantly berated with the idea that we're the failure and the cause of the failure of whatever election that takes place, where, say, conservatives tend to win or whatever. So Black men become the face of that. Or I can talk also about, how we're ignored. Like this year, one of the things I've noticed when you start to talk about massive unemployment in this last number from January to now, one of the things we've been seeing is how many people have been losing jobs, the loss of DEI under Trump, so on and so forth. And yet, in that, when you actually look at the BLS data, Black men's unemployment has been through the roof. There's only like a couple of months where you actually had Black women's exceeding Black men's, and then it shifted right back to form where Black men's unemployment was through the roof. And yet the conversation has been about everybody but Black men. It's become a norm. It's the floor people want to stand on to where they don't even want to look at the question. So if you introduce that, people's eyes glaze over. But if you talk about any other demographic that experiences that, all of a sudden it's interesting again. And so, it's so getting into ways where Black men can be blamed or ignored, and this can be done in an era of hyper information. Hell, in the era of AI,
Oh,
you can ask ChatGPT about Black men. They can tell you how malign Black men are, and yet and still in the public conversation, there's a dismissal that takes place that we are schizophrenically tied to, where we can accept ignoring or downplaying Black men's experiences, even though we all kind of know that they tend to be at the lowest levels, and tend to be the most barred from access. So, I think we've grown very comfortable in this country, most particularly with that dynamic in place. And I think that plays a lot into what you were saying earlier about what practitioners even need to engage in. How do they engage in it if we have a practice of ignoring and downplaying at the same time
ooh,
and
yeah.
accepting that dynamic as normal?
Yes, yes. And it's kind of crazy. The eerie irony of what you just said is when you advocate and you call it out, you speak to like, hey, we need something different, within our praxis, right? You become, excuse my language, you become the butthole, right? You become the problem.
Right.
You become the person that is, proverbially spinning in the wind, right?
Yes.
So why would you disrupt everything? It's working exactly how it's supposed to work. That's essentially what they're saying,
Yes.
right? And so when you're saying no, this is not really the best way to go about it, then again, you're a troublemaker. You're called everything but a child of God, right?
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
you're bringing up this data, this empiricism and everything, in addition to that. And
Hmm.
so you become, again, all these things,
Yeah.
even a troll, if you will, right? I mean,
Right.
all these things. And I'm pretty sure you had to navigate these things. I mean, not just within the courses that we teach, but just what we stand for and advocate for as husbands, fathers, sons, etc. Right? I mean, we're doing these things because we want to make sure at the end of the day, and this is what I really appreciate about you and Tommy, is that we want to make sure Black males are alive.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
and that is I think there's a numbness often associated, with that.
Definitely.
So let's
Definitely.
keep it moving. I have a lot of these questions, but we're probably not going to get to all of them. But let's get into the flat blackness and identity. So could you unpack the concept of flat blackness and its implication for understanding the lived experience of Black males?
Well, flat blackness was a term that I actually got from the ADOS organization, American Descendants of Slaves, and they were talking about flat blackness in regard to those who are descended from from slaves here in the United North America, in particular Africans, Caribbeans. There's a delineation movement that they're a part of where they were using the term, and I actually just kind of added. You know how you find a dictionary word that has multiple definitions.
Yes.
I
Yes.
added another definition because I was looking at flat blackness in terms of gender and kind of how that played out. And one of the things I noticed was how um, Black men would be discussed in very particular ways, particularly in media or by Black feminists themselves, where the deaths of Black men, for example, would be added to the plight of Black men. But then when the particularities of it were brought into play, Black men were never mentioned, right? Especially when in regard to what kind of policy or funding based solutions were being proposed, they would tend to be opted toward very specific demographics that didn't include Black men. But when it was useful, our deaths, our unemployment, or whatever other negative quality was brought to bear, the data would be included. So I started to talk about flat blackness in terms of the ways in which Black men were used for their experience and then ignored. One of the more
Mm,
popular ways of looking at that was, say, during the era of Black Lives Matter. where,
Yeah, I was
you
just going
know,
to go. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
black male death was part of, you know, the sort of invitation of getting people into the conversation, and there was kind of a baiting and switching that would take place where the conversation would then shift to other demographics, be it women, LGBT, so on and so forth. But, you know, in many ways, the very men that were dying somehow weren't part of the conversation at a certain stage. And so that's one of the things that I started to kind of point to, was this kind of use of black males in order, you know, especially black male trauma, as a rationale for calling for resources. And yet when it came down to, you know, actually determining what the solutions were and how those resources could be disseminated, black men were somehow not a part of the conversation anymore. We even saw this in the Democratic Party a number of years ago. I remember when they had a convention and they put up the mothers of the movement, and these were women
Oof.
whose sons had been killed, especially in terms of police homicides, and yet none of the fathers were involved. So there was this way of taking black male death and applying it to specific demographics. And again, you know, here we're talking about black women. And I should clarify, most my particular focus in regard to black male studies, one of my primary areas is studying what I call the black gynocracy. And essentially, in a nutshell, what this is it's a divide and conquer strategy that I argue has been used against the black community. And it is one of, you know, providing a sort of surface level privilege of women and girls, and at the same time a denial to black males, and this kind of dynamic creating a tension between the two that's multi-generational. I mean, we can talk about it back to slavery. We can talk about its new reinvigoration during the 1950s and 60s, most particularly, and really implementing itself in the 1970s. But the point I look at is the way in which policy has been used to turn black men and women against each other. And one of the impacts this has is on black coupling and black family formation, and how that diminishes those kinds of things because of these tensions. So resources in particular play a key role. And you know, from the first chapter of the book, I talk at length about the specific resources involved in this dynamic. So my kind of examination about, say, the role of black feminism stems from my analysis about the development of this gynocracy and how it's functioned in a particular way, as a tool of white supremacy, as a tool of, you know, upsetting a society. And it kicks into a whole new gear after the civil rights movement. I mean, I argue that it was put into gear very much on purpose, because the civil rights movement, regardless of how you may feel about it or what you may think about it, it was, at least in terms of a blueprint, an incredibly powerful dynamic that had an impact on the world. I mean, this is probably the most, you know, widespread movement in the black community, where you had people across occupation, gender, color, you know, ideology. You had these people coming together to make arguments that impacted the world. You had African liberation movements that were inspired by it. But then within a matter of years, very short number of years, going into the 1970s, the civil rights movement becomes dismantled in a way. You're not even talking about it. And at the same time, we start to see the rise in very particular forms of feminism, most particularly misandrous feminisms. And so I kind of point to that. So when I go back to Flat Blackness and I'm talking about the gender dynamics, I'm talking about it from the vantage point of one who is studying the way gender has been used to disrupt this community that's starting to have global impact. And it wasn't supposed to. It really wasn't supposed to. The main reason that the black community ends up having the kind of global impact we had is most particularly through the Cold War and the rise in technology, right? So all of a sudden, so, you know, Russia and the US are silently competing to see who has the best standard for the world to follow. And all of a sudden, the world starts to pay attention to these black folk in the South that are being hosed and attacked by dogs and police.
Mhm.
This was not supposed to occur, right? We were not supposed to have that kind of impact. And yet it started to take place, and the world started to pay attention to us. That had to be stamped out from the vantage point of, you know, where they were calling it, when the Black Panther movie came out, all my students were talking about colonizers for a while. Right. So from the standpoint of colonizer, that the idea had to be stamped out. You could not have that small of a community with the history that it had, having the kind of global impact that it was starting to develop. So, you know, within a matter of years, that had to be stamped out. And one of the ways that that occurred was particular protest dynamics were turned against each other. And there was a lot of baiting with resources and so on and so forth. And I think one of the major ones was, you know, the rise of a very particular type of feminism in the mid 20th century that began to split the community. So I talk about it from that vantage point, and that's why when we talk about solutions to anti-Black misandry, I'm not just talking about solutions to problems imposed from the larger society. I'm also talking about it in terms of within the Black community and how certain groups are turned against each other, and most particularly aimed at Black men in a very, particular fashion. So that's kind of the framework of the book, and that's really the posture of my research. It really is about examining how that particular divide and conquer strategy was used to separate and down. And because any political ideology, any movement you have, I don't care if it's hardcore, Pan African revolutionary, or if you're talking about integrationist conservative, it doesn't matter. Whatever it is, it's all going to be based on the family. And
Yes.
if the family formation breaks down, it doesn't matter what ideology you have, none of them are going to work. There's no movement that builds large scale societies that isn't predicated on the family. Now, you can have different variations on how you define family, but if there's no formal family structure in place, no movement can sustain itself. And that's one of the things we've seen happening in the last 60 years. We've seen the breaking down of the family unit, most particularly in the Black community. And I wanted to kind of study where that came from and how it kind of played out. So this book is a contribution to that discourse.
As I listen to you, I'm thinking about, interest convergence, because that's exactly what it is. Like, this is not an altruistic attempt to remedy this situation, right? When we,
Mhm.
during, Russia is looking at the civil rights movement and everything, we seeing people get hosed, water hose, right? And bit by
Mhm.
dogs and everything. This is what Du Bois was talking about. You all are not doing this because it's the right thing to do, right? And the same thing with Brown v. Board. You know what I mean? So all these are examples that speak to exactly what you're talking about, right? And
Mhm.
even we'll take it to, more contemporary times. And you alluded to this, and I really want you to expand, if you would, the whole BLM. You know what I mean? Because people make this quick analogy like, oh, it's the new civil rights movement and everything. But again, the whole interest convergence that was associated with, the funding, all the other support and the brokering and the relationship with political parties and things like that. Now, I guess you could make the argument like, okay, well, civil rights, they kind of deal with some of the things, but not to the degree, right? That
Mhm.
you have here, because it was primarily based upon, like our brother Dr. Tommy Curry says, of Black males dying. You know what I mean? And it
Mhm.
wasn't like almost like this quick pro quo, like, yeah, you speak to the Black male's death and everything, but don't have Black males as part of the solution or
Right.
amelioration of that,
Right.
and we're going to give you money. You know what I mean? We're going to give you
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And and you compare that to the civil rights, where you had people who were advocating, who were, you had the whole conversation of the nonviolence, but you have a book that by Cobb talking about this nonviolent stuff will get you killed, right? And you have people who were about that life,
Mhm.
who had guns, Negro
Mhm.
guns, so on and so forth, that it wasn't just about the rhetoric, right? It was about the work. And
Yeah.
people were willing to risk their lives, not just career, not
Right.
just ideology. I'm on this side today and I'm on this side tomorrow and everything. I get likes and everything. It wasn't about that. And
Mhm.
so I try to tell my students, like, no, you can't just simplify it like this is the modern civil rights. And this is not me just coming for BLM, but I'm like, this is the reality. If
Mhm.
you look at it now, we haven't really heard much from BLM outside of a few, unapologetic brothers who have been saying some things. But outside of that, you haven't heard. It's not like the situation Black males have stopped dying or Black people have stopped dying.
Mhm.
That hasn't happened. But
Mhm.
it's not the vitriol, right? It's not the same
Mhm.
And this is what I've heard you say, and Dr. Tommy Curry said, well, there's it's kind of like it's not in fashion anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
been doing this work around Black males for, man, over 20 years now.
Mhm.
And there was a time like when Obama was in office, to advocate and support Black males, it was in fashion again. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Around my brother's keeper and everything, it became
Mhm.
in vogue. There
Mhm.
was money, there was all this stuff associated with it. So if you were doing anything around black males, oh, you were it. And I'm like, man, this stuff isn't new. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So it's kind of analogous to that. I don't want to get on my
But
soapbox.
notice how quickly that was attacked.
Yes,
When you started to talk about that, as quickly as it was presented to the public, it was taken down just as fast.
yes,
So the whole question of, and this goes back to, really the question of how anti-black misandry functions. The very idea that there could be support extended, again, has to be stamped out, has to be withdrawn. It can't occur without argumentation, without difference. And the irony is, most of that started, at least formally speaking, from within the black community itself. The petition that went out nationally to tamp that down came out of many black women's efforts. Those were the first people that I saw bring it to bear. You know what I mean? Because the argument was that this was directed toward boys. Now, when you found out more about My Brother's Keeper, one, it wasn't necessarily federally funded, and it wasn't targeted specifically at black men, even though that was the perception of it. Black young men, that was the perception. It was young men of color, and
yes,
it wasn't federally funded. But the idea was, because it didn't include girls, it must have been inherently sexist. And then I remember at the time when it was being kind of, the petition was being brought around. My question was kind of, I was still developing and I was still asking questions, but I was kind of like, well, isn't there a White House Council for Women and Girls? And then all of a sudden there'd be a lot of quiet. There'd be a lot of silence. Nobody wanted to say anything about that there was no White House Council for men and boys, let alone black boys. So even just the gesturing toward this attempt led to a blowback that, for the most part, I won't say it destroyed My Brother's Keeper, because it was around, but you really didn't hear about it after that in a very particular way. And, so the whole question about the possibility of resources being targeted at black boys was led to, it just led to an eruption of frustration from many different sides of the aisle. I mean, you may have
yes,
expected it to come from the white community, but from within the black community, very few people saw that coming. Even, with the early development of BLM, like you talked about, many of us did see BLM as the evolution of the civil rights movement. But you also got to remember how long the pauses were between the 1970s and the advent of BLM in terms of widespread activism. Like, to me, it was, I remember in the 1980s, it was the divestment from South Africa. That was a movement for a while. And then there was, there were small movements, but you really didn't see a large scale movement pop up again until you get to BLM. And most of us, when we heard the chant, we didn't, first of all, we didn't know it was an organization. Many of us, we didn't know. Unless you
right,
were actually in Ferguson, which many people couldn't afford to just drop and go, you just thought it was a chant. You thought it was, and then when you found out it was an organization, it was like, oh, okay, well, cool. It's the continuation of the movement. But with the feminist undertones to it, the exclusionary misandry within it, most of us were caught off guard entirely, unless you were keyed into people like Darren Seals, who was on the ground in Ferguson talking about how this was, how things were going on, talking about how when you initially had this kind of confrontation with the police, the tensions around Michael Brown's death, and then all of a sudden you had this group of people who were not from Ferguson coming in, sitting on street corners on Twitter, kind of absorbing the attention and the resources from the movement, and then all of a sudden you have this rise of this Black feminist organization shooting into the stratosphere. And yet the people on the ground in Ferguson are saying, we're still standing here. Where are the resources? Where, and this is before 2020. By the time you get to 2020, you're talking about 90 million, if I remember correctly, that BLM is said to have amassed. And that's post 2020. So, even prior to that, there were untold millions that kind of took off then from Ferguson onward. And yet it didn't reach the families on the ground who were losing mostly black male sons, husbands, boyfriends, whatever it may be, right? Brothers. So these were kind of the tensions that we were trying to tease out and understand in the midst of this rising social media moment, which is a technology that we'd never had before. So all of these things are occurring at the same time. But when you look at it from the vantage point of trying to understand anti-black misandry, you can see a consistent stream of how black men were treated and perceived and whatnot, even to the deaths of key Black Lives Matter activists. You're talking about
yes.
mostly
Speak
black
on it.
men.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. Talk about that.
burned alive in cars, and Darren Seals himself. And there's still not very much discussion going on about that to this day. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to draw questions to and really analyze and look at, because this ongoing treatment, I think Curry kind of hits it out of the park when he starts to frame racism as misandric aggression. And he
Mhm.
ties in with Jim Sedanius's work with social
Yes.
dominance theory. And so
Mhm.
you kind of really begin to see the onset of really Western civilization being predicated on the undermining and underdeveloping and the outright, at times, murder of Black males. You know, you start to see the relationship on a larger scale beyond just individual acts of racism. You start to see how it functions on a structural scale, and how Black men become the face of the problems of the community, the problems of the society, as it were. And so you can look at it from that superstructural standpoint, or you can look at it in terms of an intra communal standpoint issue. You know, right? Because as you pointed out, within Black Lives Matter, there were discussions about how Black men shouldn't lead. I mean, I've gone to Black Lives Matter meetings where they would walk Black men out, once telling them, you can't lead. You're not going to be in a position of leadership. You have to be a woman. You have to be LGBT. And so you have this kind of denial, right? Where we were good enough to die, but we weren't good
Mhm.
enough to lead. And even the organizations that did, the chapters, I should say, that had Black male leaders, often wouldn't get funding or attention from within BLM. So there are all
Mhm.
kinds of tensions going on. But looking at it from a standpoint of anti-Black misandry, you could kind of see the connecting fibers that helped us to really understand that this goes deeper than, say, individual acts of racism. This is more of a structural issue that has had that has been strategically maneuvered into spaces that we just had not thought about. So when you're experiencing anti-Black misandry within your own family, and you're
Yes.
really starting to see it for the first time whether you're a young man or a middle-aged man or whatever, when you first start to understand the nature of it, you're just like, it's like being a fish in water and you're trying to describe water, but all you've ever known is water. So how do you do that? But
Absolutely.
once you get the terminology to do it and the concepts are being introduced to you, now you're starting to be able to see the water for what it is. And that has produced a whole new discourse. And that's, how I approach this idea of Black male studies.
As I was listening to you, and I wanted to talk about a subject that we have to address, and it's in the title of your book, is death, right?
Yeah.
Um, in my research, I use the term thanatological aspect of it, right? So that the talking about dying, right?
Hmm.
Um, and we know the past few weeks we've had brothers who
Hmm.
have been,
Yes.
you know, hung, right,
Yes.
or hanged. Excuse me. So it's
They've
like,
been framed as suicides, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so we see these type of things happen, and outside of us, right, within the global society, people often come numb to that because of, again, you'll take a situation like the unfortunate situation that happened to that Ukrainian young lady and everything, and the brother that had issues, right?
Hmm.
Who unfortunately, took her life and everything. Those become the Kodak moments, right? Those they become the
Yeah.
situation that these are now poster boys for, and I using the term boy deliberately, for Black males in
Yeah.
general, right?
I call it transference, right? Where one Black male like that somehow becomes the reflection of all Black males. But if you
Yeah.
think of somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, he doesn't become the reflection of all white men.
Speak on it.
It's a
Yeah.
one-sided dynamic. So I don't care if it's a guy knocking over a liquor store or a shooting in a gang or whatever it may be. Somehow that becomes the face of all Black men. Whenever something like that, even this recent, assassination that we saw on television, nobody associates that the person who committed the act with all white men. But when you talk about Black men who have killed somebody, then all of a sudden that becomes the face of all men. And so these are some of the things we've been fighting with, even fighting against, even within Black studies for generations. We've been trying to
Yes.
kind of outline how this functions in a very problematic way. But I didn't mean to interrupt, but I had to add that because you were dead on.
No, no, no. This is a conversation. This is discourse. And thinking about, deaths and everything, I'm thinking back to in my when I was married previously, and because I've always scoured the data and everything with research. And you know that sometimes you look at some of the data and everything,
Hmm.
and it'll make you weep. You know what I mean? It'll make you literally cry. And it's like, does anyone else see this crap? You know
Right,
what I mean?
right,
Like, is
yeah,
there anybody else like passionate about ameliorating this situation? Am I the only one seeing this? And so
yeah,
that's why. brothers such as yourself and sisters, like shout out to my sister Zakia out there doing her thing in Maryland. Even sisters who are doing this work, putting black males on the front line, need to make sure we, shout them out because not just a shout out, but the work. But I wanted to get into the death, right? The conversation. So you discussed Black Death as both literal and symbolic. What are
Okay.
some of the key drivers of the crisis in the U.S.? I think we kind of touched on some of them, but if you could kind of elaborate, and you're pulling up some data right now that is really going to just allow our participants to really see some of these things in real time.
Well, I tried to deal with it in the book. I called it Black Andro Mortality. And what I was looking at was, chronicling the various ways Black men lead in terms of death. And I thought it was important. I tried to do that. I'm not as much a theoretician as I am, and someone that tries to look at this from a grounded kind of perspective. So I actually looked at the specific ways that Black men tend to lead in death in various ways. So I talked about life expectancy. I talked about COVID, because many people that was one of the weirdest things in the midst of COVID. I remember there was a document that I did a show on YouTube that I want to say it came out of Harvard, and the document was talking about Black women's death rates in regard to COVID, and it wasn't very long. It was only a page or two. But when I got to the second page of the article, it said, it spent the entire article listing the ways that women were experiencing COVID. And then it actually said in one line, it was like a bullet point, but Black men's deaths do exceed every other demographic. And then it continued to talk about Black women, and it even mentioned white men and Asians. And I'm blown away because I'm reading this like, this is what I mean when I talk about the erasure of Black men, this kind of passive
Just
anti-Black agenda.
happenstance, just happened,
It's
and
just
and,
happenstance.
and we know the research. I think um, our indigenous brothers may have been hit a little harder than we did. I think we lost 3 years. I think they may have lost 5 or 7.
But
Just like,
this is when this first came. It was first kind of being framed. So you're right in terms of the longer frame, but we were in the midst of it at the time.
okay,
It was still 2020. It was still
okay,
going
gotcha,
on.
gotcha,
And
gotcha.
so one of the first documents that we got that actually began to frame this, and I actually don't know. I don't think they actually included um natives in that one. But my only point was you had this whole document, and you could understand more if you study the history of racism. You could understand if this was mainly about white experiences with death in regard to COVID, and they downplayed Black men, but it was actually about Black women. And so
Hmm.
you had to be three-fourths into the article to find this one line, and it was just kind of strange that that was occurring. So I started to in this chapter really just kind of outline those experiences, data around cancer rates, data around suicide, kind of things that we don't hear talked about in the mainstream anywhere near as much as we need to. So I just kind of framed it around that. I looked at homelessness, but homelessness in regard to mortality,
Mm.
which I didn't think was discussed enough. And you got to, and I'm not saying this as if you don't remember, but people have to remember during COVID, when you talked about homelessness, the conversation wasn't about the homeless and anywhere near as much as it needed to be. Because really, when you get down to brass tacks, Black men were far overrepresented in regard to homelessness prior to COVID. And then COVID hit, and there was a kind of silence, not just about Black men, but about homeless. In my humble opinion, there was a silence as far as homeless mortality in regard to COVID. And then the conversation became about, who were being evicted, but there was not enough conversation about people who were actually dying on the streets. You know what I mean? So I tried to do this subsection on homelessness mortality in regard to Black men during that era, most especially because I just thought, there was so much of it that wasn't being discussed. And that kind of, went into, substance. Of course, if you're dealing with homelessness, you got to deal with deaths
Yes.
in regard to substance abuse. So that was kind of part of it. I dealt with child fatalities.
Mm.
I also dealt with police homicide. You have to when it comes to Black men because we've always been far overrepresented there. Hell, leading up in the 2010s all the way up to COVID in 2020, we as far as police homicide, we started to see websites that were producing data on annual death rates. And one of the things we tend to find was that Black men were far overrepresented. And even on conservative levels, it was 200 to 300 deaths per year of Black men. And for a group as small as we are, that's the overrepresentation is ridiculous. So I tried to chronicle all of these deaths and to really kind of frame the image of black male life, in terms of again, andromortality, because um, I had not seen any data that framed black male death and the myriad ways that it's presented. In many ways it presents itself in life. I had not seen anywhere where there's an attempt to just frame it. And when I tried to frame it, what I tended to find in too many categories was that black men were dying more than anybody on too many fronts. It didn't make sense. How can you go from COVID to cancer to homelessness to substance abuse to, there was just so many categories where black men were either at the absolute bottom or I think the closest groups, as you kind of mentioned, is when we started talking about Native men, and we could see those alignments there. But most of the time I found too many categories where black men were dying, and it just bothered me that I had not seen a discussion about that. So my approach to death was to really just kind of force an empirically based a narrative of deaths, in the reader's face, to say this is how black men die, and the myriad ways that it takes place, and this is how much we don't talk about it, that we actually haven't really had any national conversation about these different areas in conjunction with one another. So I'm not saying there aren't discussions about homelessness and death. I'm not saying there's no discussions about COVID deaths. I'm not saying there's no discussions about suicide, life expectancy, but I had not seen where all of those conversations were tied together around black male death and looked at from that framework. So that's what that last section before the agenda tries to really kind of break down. It's just really an image of the various ways we die and how impactful and costly that has been for generations. And in many
You,
ways,
you,
it's increased.
you know that I want you to delve into this is um what Dr. Love often calls like either this symbolic killing or the spirit murdering of black males. And I would beg to guess that starts very early. I talked about early childhood earlier in our conversation, but talk to us like the ways in which you see that kind of those symbolic deaths, right? Those tropes that are often out there that are reemerging that kind of, suffocate us, from employment or, so on and so forth, right? Those type of things. Or like I said earlier, that spirit murder and the symbolic deaths that are taken away from that young young brother in his in his in his infancy, right? And it's just coming out, right? Where they're just want to experience the world and they're cute, right? But we know, especially with black males, that adultification happens so quickly, right? And that's going back to the poster, those of you who saw for the course and everything. I have that, that image comes from Nas, right? And you
Mhm.
see those young brothers, right? With, toy guns and robots and everything. But again, the adultification we see that happens that is sometimes spirit murdering,
Yeah,
symbolic, but we see in Tamir Rice's case, right?
it's
It's
literal.
fatal and it's real.
Mhm.
And other young brothers' cases, it's very real, Um, so speak
Well,
to us
you
a
can
little
talk.
bit about that.
You could talk about it from in reference to social access. I think you're kind of implying some connections there in regard to not even being able to get out of K through 12 on a competitive level,
Yeah.
if you were interested in going to college, and finding the difficulty there. But I'll say this: my approach to it changed radically about 20 years ago, because I used to look at it both in terms of what I had read and in terms of what I had experienced growing up. But my son was born, and I got to experience that social death on levels that, I thought I understood because I lived through it. But it's a whole nother thing to live through it as a parent, watching it occur. So my son is 20. He's in his third year of college. So we've been very blessed in that sense. And he's also 7 feet tall. So you can imagine the kind of tension, the kind of, hostility, veiled and, overt, that he's experienced. And I've watched institutionally as well as personally how these practices have hit him. I've seen him be excluded. I mean, I talk about this at length on my show on YouTube, where even as in the beginning of his kindergarten year, they try to put him into special ed. And yet this boy was reading 700-page Harry Potter books in the first grade. You know what I mean? And you're telling me this is the kid that goes into special ed. So it was a doubly personal experience to be reintroduced to the things that I'd lived through and the things that I'd studied by analyzing my son's life experiences with that. And so when you talk about social death, the denial of access, most especially to the kind of ideas around middle class life that a lot of people aspire to, whether you're talking about being able to amass enough capital to own a home or start a business or to be able to go to school, things of that nature, you find the stereotypes and the perceptions of Black males as being monsters, as being boogeymen, as Dr. Curry would call it, or being the perpetual problem, right? Considered tied to violence, tied to rape, tied to violation, is so consistent that it kind of plays through. I even dedicated some of my earlier papers in the 2010s to looking at the way that we weren't calling it misandry at the time. I was calling it gendered racism, but I was looking at the ways that sexual discrimination was another method that kind of excluded Black men. And that whole definition kind of changed post Me Too. But I'll say for that time period, we were looking at the ways in which Black males would experience various types of sexual discrimination in the workplace, for example. And the idea was a little inverted. So for women, right, the idea was that somebody might have say something that's sexist or touch you or something of that nature. And obviously we have a frame of reference for that type of sexual discrimination. What happens when you're assumed to be a violent threat, even though you haven't done anything? What happens when you're assumed to, be motivated to violate somebody and accused of it when you haven't done anything, right? The assumptions that stem from centuries of stereotypes about Black male aggression and perversion and even downright savagery, primitivity, those old stereotypes are still very resonant in how Black men are perceived and treated. So instead of you doing some, or I should say, so instead of someone actually grabbing you or calling you something, actually having to endure false accusations because of racist and stereotypical assumptions people make about you and talking about that as a form of sexual discrimination. That was a conversation that I was trying to have in 2013 and onward because most didn't have a frame of reference for how that could function against Black males in a way that they weren't responsible for. And so we were trying to have those discussions. And then post Me Too, conversations amongst male-centered groups, it started to center around false accusations. But again, they weren't tying it to this legacy of how Black men were perceived as monsters and initiators of violence, and particularly sexual violence. So when you connect those two things together, you associate it with the history of Black men being falsely accused, there wasn't enough discussion about that, as far as I'm concerned, until you have Black male studies, where there was a
No,
willingness to go back to that history.
no, absolutely. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about um, Dr. Curry's t- um, phallicism. I'm thinking
Right,
about that,
right, right.
and I'm thinking about books such as Mandingo. You know what I mean?
Mhm,
That kind of
mhm.
situate that type of phallicism, and
Absolutely.
it still exists today. As you were talking, I'm not going to go into
Yeah,
great details, but I had a student that had navigated exactly what you conveyed. When
absolutely.
and these things are not one-offs. They happen very frequently. And it's like, a Black male walking in the skin that they're in,
Mhm.
it's a different reality. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? You think about the bigger Thomases, the characters, you think
sure,
about
absolutely.
all these situations, right? You think
But
about the elevator situations, you know what I
oh
mean?
man, exactly, exactly. But if I can take your point about bigger time, we talked earlier about developing terminology that explains Black males' experiences, right? In describing anti-Black misandry, one of the concepts, one of the ways that I argue it's been presented is what I call heterophobia. And so you're talking about anti-Black male heterophobia, right? And I remember when I was first explaining this to a number of people, at first I get these kind of looks like, what does that mean? And then it doesn't take long for them to understand it. So the fear of heterosexual Black men, right? Sounds like, okay, where does that come from? But if you go back to lynching and you look at how many Black men were lynched based off the accusation of having sexually violated most usually a white woman. That was the rallying cry for lynchings, right? Up until the mid 20th century. You heard that as the most primary base accusation extended to black men who were lynched.
To Kill
But
a Mockingbird. I mean, we got
there it
so
is.
many different examples of it,
There it
right?
is, right? So I talk about that as one, I think, of 13 different types of anti-black misandry, but it's specifically targeted to heterosexual black males. It's not targeted toward anybody else, or at least the assumption of who's heterosexual, right? It kind of it goes in that direction. But the point I'm making is that you have to create terminology that explains that dynamic so that we can articulate and clearly see when this is occurring and how. But the base assumption is that tying into this legacy of black men being a sexual threat that goes back to slavery, you can see the narrative that brings us all the way up through Jonathan Majors.
Yes, yes.
I'm blanking on the singer
Chris Brown.
Chris Brown. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
The last,
Breezy.
the
Yeah,
last set of accusations he got, almost ruined his career, and he was able to show the
yeah.
text that he was getting from the woman who was accusing him, and that exonerated him in that kind of fashion. But the point is, people were ready and willing to take those kinds of accusations as truth simply because you're talking about black men, and we've all been acculturated to accept black men as violent criminals based on this legacy and history that goes back through slavery. So actually being able to name it, look at it for it's the historical role it's played, and then be able to use it to question how that still continues to function in today's society is something we have to continue to do. We just have to create the tools to make it easier and more apparent.
Listen, speaking of vocabulary and language, again, we have I misspoke earlier. We probably got about 13 minutes and everything. So go ahead and put your question in there. I'll read them. We'll get to them. I just have a question that dovetails, I think, rather well on what you just conveyed about heterophobia, because I've had some students that fall in this particular category who've come to me and explain like they have to navigate this. And I forget, I don't have my book open in front of me, but it's like anti-black male kind of transphobia, something that speaks to that, like how there's still the association of the black male genitalia and that
Yes.
fear and everything. Again, so again, he's done the research and everything, but I've had students, you know what I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
that are within his community and say, hey, Dr. Rashid, I have to go to this bathroom or I have to do this
Mhm.
because of, what you're speaking to. So can you just touch on that a little bit? Because again, a lot of people don't understand what, students who are within this community are grappling with and everything. And it's a real life situation.
Are you talking about one of the particular? Let me see. I'm trying to look at which one you're referring to. One of the particular points of anti-black misandry, or were you talking
Yes, it's
more generally?
one. I think that's the one right there. We just passed it. I think
Oh, let me see.
it was called trans, and I don't have my book where.
Oh, okay. Hold on. I think that's further down.
Yeah, I think it's further down. I just
Um,
know trans, and I'm like, okay,
yeah,
that was
this doesn't. I don't have a PDF one that navigates as well as I'd like. But anyway,
when I see it, I'll be like, okay, yep, there it is.
there it is.
Yeah,
Transphobia.
there it is. Yep, yep,
Right. So I talk
yep.
about it as the seventh version. The black male image is represented as sort of fetishistic homophilia or transphilia in media. When this occurs, it is highly stereotypical. Is that so? Essentially, when you're talking about, especially in media, they like to use some of the most imposing black men to play this role out, especially highly muscular and whatnot.
Mhm.
Men who represent what we would normally refer to as this kind of hyper masculine presentation, and then we see them kind of feminized in a particular way, as a form of entertainment. And I kind of talk about it from there, how that practice becomes a feature for representing black men in entertainment. But I'm not sure if this is the one you were actually
Let's see.
talking
But
about.
it says, but I think right there it says, but homophilia is an important feature of misandry because the study I'm saying there's often a strong emphasis on feminine. No,
Now, I
I
think this
think
is you might be referring to. Let me see. Let me see.
no. Let's see.
There's a sexual objective, social incompetency, transfer.
No, it's not
No,
transference.
transference is the one I
No,
was
that's the
talking about
other.
earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, not
So that
that.
was. I think that was the only one that dealt with that.
But I think you speak to that in one of the like how it is for. those trans students to be quickly reminded of their,
one
their
one
born, you know what I mean? I don't
Well,
want to.
the fears of I think there's a kind of running theme of the fear of maleness in a very particular way. So if you're talking about trans women, obviously, because remember, for example, I want to say this might have been around 2020 as well. It's not a little earlier. I think it might have been 2018 and 2019. There was these remember the discussions around bathrooms,
Yes,
bathroom
yes,
use,
yes,
and
yes. And that's kind of
so
where this it stemmed from my students. They were
yeah,
like,
yeah.
Dr. Rashid, listen,
I know
it,
which one you're talking about now. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
So what
yeah.
I was saying was, okay, first when it comes to trans men, nobody really had too many questions. Like people were not worried that trans men were going to be sexually violated in male bathrooms. It's not to say nobody was, but that wasn't the national discussion. The whole
Mhm,
question of bathrooms and trans was centered around trans women and how they might violate girls in women's bathrooms, right? And the only reason that that became an issue is because of the association with trans women with maleness and their the capacity through the use of the phallus to violate girls. So I was pointing out how there's this kind of bias going on that's related to maleness, this kind of misandry that's taking place even within a conversation about trans that you wouldn't think would take place. You wouldn't think that there would be an emphasis on maleness in this kind of conversation, but there's this running theme of it being a problem. And when I talked about trans men, I didn't talk about it in regard to bathrooms per se, but I did talk about it in terms of those men who were violated by police officers, in terms
mhm,
of harassment and sometimes even police homicide, based on the assumption that they were heterosexual men, right?
mhm.
And there were cases that I kind of called out in different publications leading up to this book where I was pointing out trans men who were killed on the assumption by police officers that they were male. So there's this ongoing theme going on with trans women, trans men, where there was still an anti-black misandry at play that you really wouldn't think about in that way, but it still tied them together in a very particular way. So heterosexual black men, homosexual black men, trans women, trans men, there's this running theme of anti-black misandry that kind of connects all of them in a very particular way. And I'm not saying that's the only discussion to have. I'm just saying that's a discussion that too few have. And I just wanted to put that on the table to add that to the discourse because these are things that people are experiencing and losing their lives over on the base assumption that their inherent black maleness or whatever's associated with maleness is a threat to everyone else.
No, absolutely. And there's a book, I can't think of the title right now, forgive me, but it talks about it, underscores that what you're referring to, that violence that is really inflicted upon trans, in particular Black trans folks, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, but again, I like the way you're nuancing it. You know what I mean? To say,
Mhm.
hey, there is
There's
a
something there.
difference. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're talking about. So we're at time. So let me to see, Randy, how can I look at some of these questions? All right, cool, cool. So this is anonymous students. In post BLM, a second election of Trump, what can regular Black men do to keep their families educated without losing themselves? Wow.
And keep their families educated about.
So in the post Black Lives Matter, in the second election of Trump, what can I don't know what regular means, regular Black men do to keep their families educated without losing themselves? That's
Well,
from an
if I
anonymous
can, let me
attendee.
see if I can, let's see if I can put this on the screen. Um, First I got to find out where it went. Bear with me for one moment because I want to share the screen on something. Here.
Oh, they have some
I
great
think
questions too.
this might help. I used to be a lot more savvy with Zoom, um, and I'm a little rusty. There we go. So tell me if you can see that. Is,
Yes,
is that on screen? The
yes,
political agenda?
yes, yes.
All right. All right. So this is freely available to anyone. You just go to newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. If you have an idea you want to contribute to it, you're welcome to do so. This comes out of a conversation on a platform with over 40,000 members discussing what kind of improvements can be made regarding policy, for Black male life. And you can see that it was last updated May 4th. So this was first written in 2020, September 24th. And so it's 5 years old and it's going. So here's the streamline list, the 19 points, and it goes. Let me see. I might have to shrink it a little bit. There we go. So it goes from family court reform all the way through GI Bill reparations. You know, where we're talking about black men, and you know this from teaching the history. Many black men didn't get the GI Bill, so we actually talk about those families, having some kind of restitution. Even now, we do advocate for reparations in general, but we talk about things a little more specifically. So, education, affirmative action for Black men, targeted homelessness programs. These are all policies that were extended to us by Black men themselves who were making the argument for how we can improve. So, when the question comes up about what Black men can do, this is my go to. I start with this conversation because it organically came out of a conversation with a large group of Black men from all kinds of walks of life looking at various ways that they could use policy to improve the quality of life in general. This is one of the things black men we've not had the benefit of most of the time. And I chronicle this in the first half of the book. We've had policy work against us. We've had policy work in ways that have debilitated us for generations in many ways. And of course, we can talk about that from the tamping down, the barring of developing black family wealth, all the way through employment, all the way through health care and treatment. You know, there's so many different areas we can apply the same logic to. And so here we're trying to actually craft what exactly the policies might be that black men need to benefit from. And we've seen there's been some traction. I've had politicians, I've had governors on the right and the left reach out to me and tell me about what they're doing, what was inspired by some certain arguments coming out of this document. You know, so so there is some traction. We see certain states picking up certain policies that we've been advocating for. It's not to say it directly comes from our list, but it is to say we at least now not only have a compendium of ideas, but we also kind of have our own political, kind of viewpoint where we can use this as a barometer for how much society has developed to the benefit of black men. And so when it comes to this question of how can you teach your family, how you can teach yourself what it is we can do to improve the quality of life, we point to policy. Now there's a whole nother conversation you can have about personal growth, personal accountability as a man, things you can do on an interpersonal level with family and friends and the community, so on and so forth. That's an important conversation, and there are people that do that work. Mine is really more so looking at what kinds of policy ideas can we implement that will change the environment from hostile to conducive to black male expansion and improvement in terms of access.
All
So
right.
that's so I just want to kind of point to that because that's what the book is really predicated on. These are the solutions to anti-black misandry according to how I approach it. To me, it starts with policy because policy was one of the main ways that we've experienced this type of oppression. I mean, slavery was policy.
Yes.
You know, everything we talked about in terms of what we've experienced has been policy based. I mean, Jim Crow was policy. You know what I mean? How do you reverse that? Well, you have to function. You have to deal with policy.
Absolutely. All right, they're coming in. So this is from Diana Lobes. I may be mispronouncing your name, so forgive me. Can you speak about this is a great question. Can you speak about anti-black misandry within the hospice system? Do black males get the same medical care and
Wow.
support as other groups within
Wow.
hospice? Oh my goodness, this is
Wow. That's a
I'm
powerful
glad it's
question.
addressed to you because I can speak for my mom, and it's not a male, but yeah. So go ahead, brother.
Oh, you just gonna throw it.
I'll throw it to you because
No, I
yeah.
mean, I haven't dealt with the hospice industry in terms of research directly. What I can say is what I have, run across over the years, whether we're talking about the base assumption in medical care that for years Black folks didn't feel pain, and therefore they were, as far as being treated, they were given less, all the way through the horrible treatment many elders experienced in regard to, being taken care of in various industries, especially for elders being treated amicably. I do know from personal experience, I had a stepfather who passed a couple years ago, And one of the difficulties we had in trying to find him, certain types of hospice care, were rooted in how do I put this? I actually had a very candid conversation with a director of a hospice facility. This was a white woman, and I was trying to get my stepfather in there, and she just got real candid. I don't know what it was. I don't know if she had a beer for lunch, but she was like, "Look, I'm just gonna be real with you." She said, "I'm not talking about my facility per se. I'm talking about the industry." She said, "For the most part, if you don't have any money, we're only going to deal with you to a point, if at all." Now, when you start to talk about family wealth, I mean, what exactly are Black elders experiencing? If you come out of a legacy of a lack of wealth, what exactly are you more likely to experience by the time you get close to end of life? So, access to resources has been limited for most of us for the majority of our lives. Even if you get a good paycheck at a job, and you come from a family of lack, I mean, that paycheck is not going to reverse generations of lack of wealth. And so when you start to talk about hospice care, when you start to talk about how Black men in particular are experiencing this, you have many that are, dying alone with very few resources and very poor treatment. And that doesn't even include, and I talk about this in the book, the suicide levels, but that does play a role. Matter of fact, one of the concepts I've been working on in this last month, no, last 2 months, is something I'm calling passive suicide. And what I'm finding with elder Black men is that, especially after retirement, and of course, in alignment with health issues and limited care, sometimes not getting any, you're finding Black men who are not necessarily deleting themselves directly with a gun or things of that nature, but there's a kind of resigning to life. There's a kind of, backing out. There's a kind of whatever happens, happens. And if it leads to death, and unfortunately, I'm talking about close family members that I'm seeing going through this process as well. Black men who many of whom who have engaged in John Henryism, which is another concept we talk about in Black male studies,
Yes,
this
yes,
impulse to work at all costs to save the family, to lift the family, to protect the family, working themselves to death. But what happens when you get to the retirement stage and you have not died, but you've lost a sense of purpose, you've lost a sense of direction, and then you start to experience health issues. I've talked to numerous Black men that, have kind of embraced this kind of subtle, passive resigning from life. They don't want to go anywhere. They don't want to do anything. They're literally waiting on death. And so when you tie that into, the experience with hospice care, you can kind of see how the two can overlap depending on the individual you're talking about. But overall, when you start to look at the rates of mortality, for elders, most particularly men, it's not great. It's not great.
Listen, I'll just chime in from like a different perspective. So when mom was in hospice and everything, she shared a room with another white female, right? And so oftentimes I didn't like to go in those spaces by myself
Mm,
because if that white female just started screaming and everything because we elder, whatever situation you
mm,
have, I have the trepidation. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm the only black. This is the bigger Thomas, right? We talk about. I'm the black male in here with this white woman, and she's screaming hysterically and everything. You know what I mean?
yeah.
So that's on me. So it was a different type of situation that I had to navigate in that hospital setting. And again, it's a whole lot we could go into about like the financial aspect of it and the care, right? And how many practitioners are really have the acumen to do the job they're supposed to do, period. And then how many have that acumen to deal with black males specifically? I would tend to think it's very few. Again, going back to you saying about the policy and everything. And that's why black male studies is so important for the rootum to the tootum, right? And from the we're talking about hospice until we talk about,
Yeah.
entering into this world. And so this is really so important. Go ahead, Doc. Are you
No, no,
oh,
I'm in agreement with you. Even if you look at some of the death rate charts that start from birth onward, you tend to find that Black male babies die to a higher
yeah,
extent,
yeah.
Black female babies, and then you get all the way toward end of life, and you see a consistent kind of pattern at least until the age of 65, 70 years old. So this is a lifelong dynamic, and I fully agree with you.
No, absolutely. So shout out to Dr. Clear White, another Black male study scholar out in San Jose Community College. He says, please put the full name of the books mentioned in the chat again by Dr. Johnson. I think we put it up, and I can make sure I get that to him personally if we haven't already done so. All right, let me get these questions because we're a little over time, and I really appreciate Randy and everybody behind the scenes for doing this. So in a conversation about Black men, this is from Cole Simon. In a conversation about Black men, emotional response and personal lived experience often outweigh empirical evidence. How do we guide the discussion towards a more logical, evidence-based focus without negating the value of individual lived experience? Really good question.
Well, and I think that's something Black male studies has been preoccupied with since its inception. How do you do that? How do you shift that conversation to something that's based? And we were talking about this in the earlier part of the show.
Yes.
That's been part of the task. How do you do that? And you really just kind of have to, just be bold enough to articulate it, because you'll find that people have gotten so comfortable with stereotypes that to hear data that actually contradicts them is jarring. You know what I mean? The first thing
Yeah.
most people are going to do is question, whether or not you're even accurate, so on and so forth. So, that becomes a conversation unto itself. But it's just something we have to kind of interrupt, because otherwise you see the same process playing out. People start to. It's almost like what they used to call that game, a long game of telephone. You pass the stereotypes down, people believe them, continue
Yep.
and add to them, and it just gets worse and worse. And then when you actually present the data, it's like, oh, wait a minute. You know what I mean? Because for the most part, we haven't operated with a standard as it pertains to Black males. We've just treated Black males as a problem, and we've made them a problem in every capacity. And in many ways, especially from the 1980s onward, Black men were the face of the failure of Black America. We apparently were deadbeat dads, we were drug addicts, we were drug dealers, we were criminals, and that just became the running narrative about Black men. And so when you actually start to refute that with data, like what percentage of Black men are actually in prison, what percentage of Black men actually own businesses, what percentage of Black, when you start to actually contradict these narratives with actual data, you start to find that, that many of them are wholly inaccurate. But we've not really had that kind of discussion. But I do think Black male studies is attempting to do that very thing.
No, absolutely. So there's a shout out to August. He has a couple questions on here. Wow. This is a one we've been discussing. How do you deal with the hypersexualization of Black men?
Well, are we assuming that that's accurate, or are we talking about it as
I know the brother. I think he's assuming that coming from the trope. You know what I mean?
oh,
Of
from the trope?
Black.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, we actually have to challenge it with both not only the data, but we also have to challenge it with narratives that complicate a little bit about that and reintroduce people to Black male humanity, even within the Black community itself.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think we've grown quite comfortable. Yeah, I said this a moment ago with stereotypes. We've gotten comfortable with them. And one of those stereotypes is that Black males are sexually irresponsible. It keeps going back to that Mandingo narrative.
Yes. Yes.
And I think in many ways we downplay the humanity of Black men when we do those kinds of things without actually having a more critical discussion about what's actually taking place and to what extent and how that's going. And I think depending on the discussion you're having, you have to find ways to introduce data to the dialogue. So I'm not sure what the specific type of discussion he's trying to have is, but I do find that when we limit it to that, it generally doesn't do anybody any good. So we have to complicate that with humanity. For example, and I'll try and be brief because I know you have other questions. Um, when I first started teaching at Fresno State, what brought me to teach a Black male class, because they didn't have one on the books, I created it. The reason I created it is I threw an event, and I had a rapper come to my campus, and then afterwards I hosted an event at my house, and there were a number of students there, and the rapper and his group were there, and we were all just sitting around talking and watching a little TV and eating. And I heard two freshmen, Black males, talking to each other, and they were talking about sex. Now, if you really weren't concerned about the humanity of Black males, that would have been the end for you. You'd heard these two Black males talking about sex and walked away with this sense that, again, they're Black males are hypersexual. But when you actually listen to the conversation, they weren't just talking about sex. They were actually having a conversation about the sexual expectations their girlfriends had of them
Mm,
and the types of sexual role playing that the women they were with were they weren't even asked to participate in. The women imposed a certain type of sex role playing that these young males had not been introduced to, and some of them were involved they're very aggressive. Some was dealing with um slave play, some were dealing with rape narratives, and these were things that the women were asking them to participate in. Now these young men were 17, 18 years old, so they were talking about how to navigate this. And one of the things I realized in listening to their conversation is they didn't have any support. They didn't have anyone to talk to beyond themselves. And it concerned me because I could see, and again, this was pre Me Too, but I could see how those kinds of narratives could make them vulnerable in certain
yes,
contexts if they did not understand how these things could be used and how the stories could be twisted and how, what could happen to them, even as students. You know what I mean? So when I created the class, but I also created an organization on campus for Black males because I knew in the organization I probably couldn't get them to do homework. I can do that in the class, but in the organization, we could have conversations that could get very, very personal, and it would be in a
yeah,
space that would be conducive for that. So my point is, in both environments, we were able to kind of bring a discussion to bear that helped those young men and gave them options, gave them ways of navigating that, gave them ways of even pushing back against it if they felt the need to. But my point simply is the assumption that some people would have made of just those two young men is that they're just hypersexual and that's all they're
absolutely.
doing. But they were actually having a much more nuanced conversation where their own safety was being threatened. In some aspects they understood and some they didn't. And if you don't see the humanity in those
That's right.
young men, you would step away and ignore that as opposed to get involved and actually help them navigate it. But these had to do, and this goes back to longstanding assumptions about Black men and sex that we have to navigate being imposed on us. So Black male hypersexuality just isn't about what Black men are doing sexually.
That's
It's
right.
also
Yeah,
dealing with and navigating how expectations are imposed, social expectations are imposed on Black men. And now we're at a point, because that was probably about 16, 15 years ago. We're at a point now where it's been the case for a while, but I think it's even more apparent now. There are sexual expectations of Black men that are global. There are global ideas about Black male hypersexuality, and it's not just about what Black men want to do. It's about what others want to use Black men for. And that's the part of the discussion we don't have. So we're quick to talk about Black men and what they engage in, but we don't talk about the social expectations on Black men, even on a sexual level. We don't talk about the imposition of foreign ideas about the nature of our humanity that have more to do with serving other people's sexual interests than it actually has to do with our humanity. That's the way we complicate the discussion with humanity. Who are we talking about? What is actually being discussed? And can we actually have a more nuanced conversation?
absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that, brother. As things heat up in 2025 because of the stripping of policies that harm Black American families, what can be done to build new policies to protect Black men and Black families? It's kind of general, but just quick take on.
Well, I think the agenda is what we're trying to do.
Yeah,
And the way it's done, I don't, I'm not creating a political party. I'm not running for office and trying to get the agenda put in. That's not my skill set. What I try to do is create a kind of an archive of ideas and then have people, dip into that, whether it's movers and shakers that are on their way up, it's advisors to politicians or people who want to run for office themselves, whether it's activist groups or organizations. I just tried to create a space where these ideas are there. They're easily accessible for anybody and they can be tapped into. And so as I continue to build and chronicle and archive these ideas, I want it to be available to anybody who might want to take advantage of it. And I don't mean that in an exploitive sense, but in the sense of being able to apply something in regard to their own political journey. So that to me is how we do that. But there are many ways to address that. That's just the way I've chosen.
no, absolutely. This student is anonymous, and I don't know if this is associated with your institution, But they're like, I'm a graduate student, I'm attending this for professional development activity hours. We're gonna send they have us in there. I don't know, bro. I don't know what to tell you.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if you know some, but I don't know what to tell this individual student.
Not right off. I don't.
Yeah, it's beyond me. So you need to talk to your institution to see about that. So this is from Jack North. He said, "Thank you, Dr. Tia Johnson. I have the book and I carry it daily to work on campus. What are some everyday ways you think that positive propaganda can be created by general person from true data sets such as what you and Medium Man do?" Uh,
Okay,
um,
Medium Man is another is
okay,
a
okay.
YouTuber that deals with empirical data. But what was the question though? It was
So, what are some everyday ways you think that positive propaganda can be created by the general person from true data sets such as you and the Medium Man?
yeah. I think what he's referring to with Medium Man is he's another YouTuber that uses empirical data to kind of challenge prevailing assumptions about black men. And I think that in and of itself is what many of us have been doing, whether you're on the black male study side of it, like Dr. Curry, or whether you're on the YouTube side of it, like Medium Man, or on both sides of it, like me. It's really about using data to reveal accurately the black male experience. Now, that doesn't mean that black men are always going to, look great, or that's not the presumption. The presumption is simply, can we actually get away from stereotype and operate in what is verifiably true about black men? And then from there, actually give accounts, tell stories, give experiences that highlight black male humanity. That's what I tried to do a moment ago when I talked about those two young men. I tried to take the discussion from hypersexuality to two young men who would be assumed to be hypersexual, actually having a more nuanced conversation. That to me is how you do that. You complicate assumptions and stereotypes with accurate data and with narratives that expose black men's humanity. That's the way I approach trying to do that. That's the way I advocate for. I'm not saying that's the only thing that can be done, but that's what I've found to be accurate and useful. You know,
Okay.
starts with truth
Brother
telling.
North has a couple of questions, so I'm going to go to somebody that I haven't read the question just for the sake of time. It's not a diss to you, Brother North, Jack North. So this is from my brother Joshua Stroud. Very interesting question. He said, "Have you researched the constant accusation of homophobia within the community?" And then states, "I don't believe it exists. I think black men appreciate masculinity and have very little fear of homosexuals. I feel there is anti-black misandry is behind this accusation. I also believe that we are very protective of our homosexual friends and family." So
Okay.
I guess what
I think
yeah,
I get.
yeah,
I haven't delved into that in terms of contemporary arguments regarding accusations of homophobia amongst black men. What I talk about in my classes is more the context for black sexuality in America, and so I talk about it from slavery onward and the advent of the black church. And one of the things I talk about with my students is the way in which black sexuality was kind of framed, especially during slavery. We were considered in many ways. It was a kind of exoticized kind of approach to things where whites could actually explore their own imagination, the ideas imposed on us by their own sexual interests. And so by the time you get to the end of slavery and the development and expansion of the black church, one of the things the black community has to refute with are white assumptions about black exotic sexuality. And so the kind of conservatism that you kind of see with the black church in regard to sexuality, especially throughout the 20th century, is in many ways a response to the public assumptions about black people's, most particularly during slavery and onward, about black hypersexuality, and not just limited to the men. Black hypersexuality was also tied to black women as
yes,
well.
yes, yes.
Ideas about black women being hot for it, so on and so forth. These ideas permeated the 20th and 19th centuries as far as sexuality was concerned, that that black people were inherently so. And this I mean, it even goes back to Africa, right? The ideas about primitivity and hypersexuality are very old when it comes to black folk in the African world. So they stem from very old roots. and they continue on to this day in many ways. So the Black church, in many ways, was trying to respond to that inhumanity in its conception of Black sexuality, and so that the kind of conservatism that we could talk about, especially through the 20th century, came out of that. And it wasn't until the sexual liberation movements that you started to kind of see people kind of expand. But there was always a gay community. Everybody kind of knew it. Matter of fact, I just did an interview a few months ago um, with Cleo Monago.
Yeah, I know Brother Cleo. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I did a
yeah.
like a 2 hour interview with him that I let my students, I assigned to my students, but he talks about that kind of history of Black homosexuals in the Black community. And so it was something that was that well known. It wasn't really a secret, but there was, even during the Harlem Renaissance, this kind of tamping down of it, not out of pure hatred or so on, but really out of this kind of history of how Black folk were perceived by white society in regard to sexuality. So as it begins to come out post 1960s, and people start to explore, and of course we had the civil rights movement and onward, the rise of second wave feminism, we started to see an expression of it. There is a conservatism around it, but it has historical context. But in that respect, we've seen the rise and expansion of representation regarding the LGBT community and so on and so forth. So it's become more mainstream than it ever was. But I haven't really researched contemporary data around Black males and homophobia in that sense. So
Yeah, shout out Dr. Mango doing his work. I took his term, same gender loving brothers, or same gender loving folks, right?
same
So
gender loving, yeah,
yeah, he does good research and he puts it out there. All right,
yeah.
so let me go to, because listen, we can't take any more questions because we're running out of time, y'all. Y'all staying here with us, man. Y'all want to hear it. So let me hear from, I think we have one from Colson before. So this is from Josiah Jacobs. So Dr. Johnson, how do you think it changes our perspective of the Reconstruction era if we examine the fear slash anxiety that white men had of black men ruling over the South, especially if we look at this from the view of social dominance theory and how in-group men are worried about out-group men taking their resources and women. I don't think there is a coincidence of why we haven't seen anything remotely close to that level of governance from black men since that era.
Okay, I wish I could see the question because that was a.
Yeah, is
Could
there
you,
a way? I don't know, Randy,
or maybe you just repeat it one more time for me?
yeah, I don't mind repeating it. And
Thank you.
so how do you think, excuse me, how do you think it changes our
Oh,
perspective? There it is.
there we go. Thank
Randy
you.
on top of
Thanks, Randy.
it.
How do you think it changed our perception of the Reconstruction era if we examine the fear that white men had of black men ruling over the South? How does it change our perspective? Well, I'll start with the first part of the question, right? So there was a huge fear during Reconstruction of not only the black folk, black men in particular, but black men especially in regard to the vote, right? This whole question of black men voting, this spawned the Klan and a number of other types of vigilante-based violence. There was a fear that congregation of black folk in the South would be able to take political control or have at least an extreme amount of influence over the politics of the South if they were able to vote on equal terms with white men. So there was a huge fear about that. There's no question. So I think that in and of itself does force us to re-examine the Reconstruction era and see the hostility inculcated in that time period and beyond to prevent the black community from doing so. Because you notice, after the formal end of slavery, 1865, the end of the Civil War, by the time you start to really, have black folks, made citizens and given the right to vote, one of the first things that happens is vigilante violence, so much so that it nearly takes a century to the year, almost a century to the year, before black folk are able to actually vote. There are periods where we voted, here and there, but of course that was met with, like I said, vigilante violence. So there's no question that era should be seen from the vantage point of white fear. But let me go on to the second part, especially if we look at this from the view of social dominance theory and how in-group men are worried about out-group men taking their resources and women. I actually look at it more in terms of out. Well, yeah, no, he's right. I agree with him. So social dominance theory is talking about basically in this context the fear white men have of black men taking their women, but he's framing it in Sedanius's language, so I understand what he's saying. So if we look at it from that vantage point, how do we reconsider Reconstruction? So you have a sexual fear there, and that of course can be argued to kind of create some or instigate more of the violence extended to black men, the lynching era, and we know that's what the lynching era was, right? Accusations of false accusations of rape, so on and so forth. One can definitely tie it to Reconstruction. One can definitely tie it to a fear, a sexual fear of losing access to one's own women from white men, and regarding white women and black men. So we definitely know sexual competition was a feature of lynching. It was reframed as protecting white women from savage black men, but much of it was rooted in sexual competition with black men and a fear of black male dominance. So I do agree with that. I don't think there's a coincidence of why we haven't seen anything remotely close to that level of governance from black men since that era. I'm not sure what governance he's referring to there, but um, I think the fear of black men is definitely a palpable aspect of how we need to look at, and it's a unique way of perceiving it that I think Black male studies is willing to entertain. Because we talk about history from an economic standpoint, and we should, a political standpoint, and we should, but looking at it from in terms of sexual competition, I think it offers us an interesting kind of undergirding to looking at the political and economic aspects of this period as well. And I think it can still be done now. I mean, the kind of shift to hyperconservatism that we're starting to see, how much of it is tied to sexual competition? Look at the actual rates of marriage, look at the rates of reproduction that are taking place, look at men who are traveling the world for companionship through marriage. Sexual competition is still very much prevalent in today's environment, and if we ignore it, I think there's a current of narrative that we miss out on, a narrative and analysis. So I think the question has merit.
Well, this will be the final question from my brother, Dr. Francis, a controversial question, but I know Dr. Hassan can handle it. So before we go into this, will be the last question. And so sorry to my brother, Jack North, who had a plethora of questions. We just due to time and everything. And just people have the questions coming in. We could be on here to 9 o'clock, but we have to go. I'm gonna take this question, and hopefully it doesn't get me canceled or consequence and everything. But I'm not worried
Man,
about
what you getting me into, man?
but I know Dr. Zah can handle this. But before we do, I want to thank everybody, the United Way for funding this endeavor, LCC, the media service, Randy in particular, the Multicultural Center, all the administration, all the faculty, students, most importantly, for being here, and my other scholars who have dropped in and participated in this important discussion. Again, please enroll in the course. Still have time, still have spots available, and definitely pick up my brother's book. So this will be the final question, and this is going to be the bomb drop. Okay. So this is from Dr. Francis. How should black men respond to the death of Charlie Kirk, who often exploited black male stereotype tropes while victim blaming and elevating the ideal social unconscious of black men, the ideal social unconscious of black man.
Well, I'm afraid it's probably not going to be the bomb drop for me that people may have wanted, because I had never heard of Charlie Kirk. And I was amazed at how many people knew who he was, because everybody was talking about him like they knew who he was, and I'd never heard of him before. So I kind of found out bits and pieces since his passing, but I really don't know much about him. And I've hesitated to say anything publicly because I didn't want to take one clip and run with that when I haven't studied the man, and I really didn't have any intention to, based on what I'm already doing with my research. But I think the most I can really say about that is very limited because of that ignorance on my part about him and his work. Um, I don't have really a coherent perspective on what his perspective was, and I'm also not clear on black folks stance on him, because I've heard people pro and for, and again, because I didn't know much about him, I couldn't speak to what they were supporting and what they were contradicting. So that said, I don't have much to offer there, and I do apologize. But as far as I can tell, I will say this much: I've seen, there's been I think conservatives have been really looking for their own messiah figure for a while, and I think there haven't been many opportunities for that. And I think um, regardless of Kirk's behavior, I think that he's kind of being pulled into that in memory. And this is actually what I wrote my dissertation on, not on Kirk, obviously, but on what I called at the time icon construction. And what my dissertation was about was the ways in which people can be turned into iconic figures, most particularly after death. There's a kind of martyrdom that takes place, but there are conflicting problems with how those kind of iconic figures can be used in the public space for different ideologies, different agendas, so on and so forth. So, I see that happening with him now. With people who, love him, people who hate him, people that that didn't know anything about him but plan to use him for their own political purposes. I saw a video clip this morning of a man who was talking about he was a Christ figure who died for our sins. I was like, what? But I'm more observant of how people are trying to use him, and that's because that's something that's always drawn to, I've always been drawn to, having grown up, and Dr. Rashid knows this because we grew up in the same era. We idolized people like Malcolm. We idolized people, who gave their lives for a particular struggle, but we also witnessed how they were reframed in the discourse in a particular way. Like if you take Martin Luther King, you talk about up through his life, he was the most hated man in many respects of his era. There were there were publications around how much whites hated him, and then all of a sudden he became a saint-like figure 20 years after his passing, and nobody would associate that much hatred with King in a public stage. But that was his experience. So the ways in which people are being reframed, I find interesting. But I don't know enough about Kirk to speak on him intelligently as far as that. But I can say as far as how I'm seeing him being used, it's almost like a hockey puck. I'm seeing different groups trying to use him and frame him in different ways. And usually that's a bit problematic, but I'm not invested in enough to be able to speak intelligently about why and what's going on with it. So I apologize, but yeah.
No, well said. So thank you for that, Dr. Francis. So if I end up on unemployment, come to speak for your couch. No, I'm just messing with you. We got scholars in that would listen, can articulate things very well. And my brother, Dr. T. Hassan, knocked it out the park. People still want to have questions and everything. And I'm like, listen, I love y'all, but you ain't got to go home, but you got to get off this Zoom, right? So listen, we'll definitely see if we could have a round two, because there's all types of contemporary current things in the world of Black male studies. Again, check out my brother Tiasan. Give them your information again before we get out of here, where they could hit you up.
I'm at Fresno State. You can find me on the website there. You can also find me on the Onyx Report on YouTube. You can go to my website, thassanjohnson.com. You can reach out to me through there. I'm on Twitter as Lord Hassan, or I guess X now. Facebook, Dr. T. Hassan Johnson. So you can find me on any of those platforms, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely. Thank you, brother. Thank you immensely. Thank you for staying in there. We're well over time. Again, the Black Male Studies course here at Lane Community College still has spots available. Come on in. If you love this conversation, we delve into Dr. Tia Hassan's masculinism and more. So we hit it, right? And we hit it in a real way. So thank you all. Thank you for my colleagues. Thank you for the students who came on in and had these tremendous questions. Again, thank you, Randy. I got your special treat on the way. And with that being said, peace and hair grease. I'm a holla.